May 20th, the U.S. government issued an indictment against Raul Castro, the former president of Cuba. This comes after months of economic warfare against Cuba, having cut the regime off from food, oil, and other vital resources. Right now, many people in Cuba are suffering, and the hope from the Trump administration is that this economic pain will inspire them to rise up against the government and institute a regime change. Here to discuss the history behind these current events is Professor Luis Martinez-Fernandez, professor at the University of Central Florida and author of the book Revolutionary Cuba, A History. Before we get started talking about the history, I wanted to ask a little bit about the situation on the ground in Cuba today. Can you explain to us, please, what's going on? What is the Trump administration doing? What does the reality on the ground look like for people in Cuba?
Well, we could spend a whole hour just on that question. Basically, the situation is that conditions in Cuba, material conditions, have hit rock bottom. That includes food scarcities, that includes areas about which the Cuban government had prided itself in for decades, such as the healthcare system and education, uh, about to collapse. Last I heard was that the Cuban government was canceling all exams in all grades, including university education. They were canceling those. That is a reflection of the fact that even the school system, because of hunger, because of difficulties with transportation, teachers not being able to show up, even that is about to collapse.
Wow, very sad. So, before we get talking more about that and spend maybe not a full hour on it, but more time on the current situation, I'd like to delve back into the history. A lot of people know a little bit about the communist takeover, communist revolution of Cuba. Not many people know about the government that it replaced. Can you tell us a little bit about Fulgencio Batista and his regime?
Sure. There are two Fulgencio Batistas actually, because he reached power in 1933 after a progressive revolution, and he was sort of the man that was left standing. That the U.S. government saw him as an alternative against the other options, which were more radical politicians. So he became a dictator, but not the harsh, brutal dictator that he became later on when he came back to power in 1952. Now, his administration was very corrupt. But then on the other hand, the Cuban economy was doing so well during the 1950s that many people were willing to look the other way. So he became acceptable because of that. Um, there were, of course, many people that were against that dictatorship from day one, but um, they were fractured and there were many divisions and there were small groups. And gradually, Batista became so odious, and eventually the U.S. withdrew its support from him very late in the game in 1958, that he was forced to flee, and many of his associates fled on the eve of January 1st, 1959.
And on that eve, is that when Fidel Castro came to power and the revolution took place?
Well, Fidel Castro was a few hundred miles away in the eastern part of Cuba, but he began his caravan, his victory caravan towards Havana, and he arrived January 8th of 1959. Before that, there were other revolutionary leaders that had already arrived in Cuba, but the regime really took over when Castro arrived a few days after New Year's Eve.
Okay. And then what kind of changes did that new government bring to Cuba? Like, how did that affect life in Cuba once the communists took over?
Well, the first reactions was an almost universal welcome of the revolutionary leaders. I must say, however, that they did not identify themselves as communists. Fidel Castro actually had more of a history of being anti-communist than pro-communist. So at the beginning, it was a diverse leadership of progressive voices from different walks of life, labor leaders, progressives, some socialists, but and also a nationalistic movement. Because one of the things that made Batista odious was that he became sort of a puppet of the United States government towards the end of his second term in office.
Okay, interesting. Now, the U.S. government late in the game withdrew their support from Batista, like you said, and then this new regime comes to power. Not that long afterwards, the United States has a breakdown in relations with Cuba. Can you explain to us how that transpired? Like, why did the U.S. government's relationship with the Cuban government, why did their relationship fray so quickly?
Yes, well, um, it's very complicated. I believe that the United States should have made a more of an effort to work, I should say, with the new revolutionary leadership. In April 1959, Fidel Castro goes to Washington, D.C. with a delegation. Again, progressive people, not communists, actually. And he was supposed to meet with President Eisenhower, who decided that it was a good day to go play golf. And he left Richard Nixon, the vice president, in charge of those conversations. And that was a moment when, as Castro put it, he said, "We're not going to do like other Latin American leaders that come to Washington to beg for money." Um, but what Nixon did was that he was really disrespectful. Castro came out fuming, and at that time, his brother Raúl Castro was in the Soviet Union, and they had a conversation in which Fidel Castro says, "This isn't going anywhere. We can't work with the Americans, so begin moving your chips with the Soviets." And the rest, of course, is history.
Okay, wow. And how did that go from an icy relationship or a just difficult relationship to the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which was, a turning point, I would say, or I would think anyway, in U.S. Cuban relations? Like, how did that transpire?
Well, originally, the United States had no problem recognizing the new revolutionary government. Um, there was an escalation. On the one hand, the Cuban government began to take over, nationalize, confiscate U.S. corporate properties, and that included plantations, that included warehouses, that included factories, and also oil refineries. So that was one of the first steps. And the United States government responded by, we're not going to let you do that, and responded with a gradual uh, trade embargo, and everything escalated. And once the Cubans were in conversations with the Soviets, then that's when it got worse. And the response of the Kennedy administration was that they inherited a plan to bring down the new government by force, and that became the Bay of Pigs invasion, which, as everybody knows, did not go well. John Kennedy referred to it as the worst day in his life, and it was, there were many problems with it. I mean, the idea was, and I think it was not a very bright way of looking at things, that the U.S. government could disassociate itself from the Bay of Pigs and claim that it was Cubans, and many tricks were involved. For example, there was an airplane painted with Cuban Air Force colors, pretending that it had defected and arrived in South Florida. Poor Adlai Stevenson, who was at the UN, was claiming, no, it's one of theirs, and nobody told him that it was actually a plane that had been painted with those colors in the United States. Now, uh, the main problem was that if you're going to go into something, you go full swing. But the Kennedy administration was shy about it, wanted to appear as if it was not that aggressive, and there were some plans for bombings to occur. They occurred a day before the Bay of Pigs invasion, but then they were canceled the following day. They were supposed to continue, and they were canceled, and that allowed the Cuban Air Force to really have a quick victory over the landing forces of Cuban exiles that had been recruited for that purpose.
Okay, so that's basically how it transpired, right? Is that they took these Cuban exiles and gave them a really, really quick and maybe insufficient training and tried to get them to go and stir up a revolution that would topple Castro. And all.
Yeah.
That's a correct understanding. Is that right?
And then there was the arrogance of many of the CIA bosses. For example, the Cubans who knew better because they were from Cuba, they said, well, this is not an auspicious landing place because it's full of very sharp rocks and that's going to be problematic if we try to disembark there. But some of these uh, believe that they knew better, said, no, that's algae. Those images are algae. Nothing will happen. Well, guess what? It wasn't algae, it was rocks. So that was part of the problem. They also believed that large numbers of Cubans would rise up and join the forces. That really didn't materialize, and there were a few other problems. They didn't go fully into it, and by that I mean the Kennedy administration. Now, it was the State Department leaders, Dean Rusk and others, who were very shy on this, and they sort of pressured Kennedy to not go full swing.
Okay. Now, afterwards, a lot of Americans have heard of or have some base level familiarity with the Bay of Pigs operation. A little bit less well known is something called Operation Northwoods, which I find to be a fascinating little tidbit of history. Can you break down for our listeners what that was?
Yes, that's a fascinating document that was made available to the public not too long ago. I think it was around 1989, and it was declassified, and it is a hair racing document to read. These were plans signed off by the Joint Chiefs of Staff of a number of measures that could be taken to bring down the new Cuban government. And, they include things like, we may want to have actual casualties of Cuban exiles. We may want to sink a boat full of Cuban exiles. And that gives us a pretext to to invade Cuba. Again, I mean, something that you would not really imagine, but it got pretty high up, and there were other plans to reduce Castro's popularity. Some of these were, again, hair raising plans. One of them was to drop leaflets with an overweight Castro surrounded by bikini clad women, so as to bring down his image, which in the eyes of some might actually bring it up. But that's how the CIA thought at that juncture.
Wow, it's almost like an AI deepfake type of thing way before that was even an issue. All right, so now I want to jump ahead to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is, I guess, probably the most famous aspect of U.S.-Cuban relations. Can you explain to us what went on during those 12 hair-raising days where the world almost came to a nuclear war? Can you walk us through that, please?
Sure. Maybe I'd like to share some family anecdotes about the Bay of Pigs.
Oh, please.
Everybody knew that the invasion was coming. The New York Times, Tat Salk, wrote a story a week or so before that. Everybody knew it was coming. And we lived in Miramar, close to the shore in the outskirts of Havana. We lived in a 4-story building, which was the highest in that section of the city. And one day, it was maybe a couple of days before the Bay of Pigs invasion, some militiamen show up to our apartment and they say everybody has to leave. Why? Because we're going to put some anti-air units on the roof of this building, so everybody has to go, which was a good thing, right? Uh, but then on the other hand, my father, I was 2 years old. My sister, I think, was just my sister wasn't even born. I was 2 years old. And my father, the good father that he was, wanted to secure some milk for me. And he was walking out with some cans of condensed milk. The militiaman said, "Wait a minute, where are you going with that?" And, you know, Cuba's a society of negotiation, and he had a few cans he gave. Well, there's one can for you, one for you. Goodbye. See you later. So that was our family connection with that episode.
All right. And then how did you guys wind up in America?
Good. Well, uh, as I said earlier, the revolutionaries were welcomed universally. Not just Castro, although Castro was very popular, but many of the others who were very popular, progressive. One of them was Camilo Cienfuegos, a very charismatic leader. So many others who were welcomed. But Fidel Castro began to show within the first few days and weeks his true authoritarian inclinations, and he was an authoritarian. Actually, some people don't like me to say this, but there's evidence of how influenced he was by European fascism. He was no Democrat, certainly. And one of the first actions is to get rid of the president. Then he got rid of the prime minister, again, progressive liberal leaders, and he pushed himself into the center of power. Um, Other actions that began were, political parties were persecuted, elections were promised, but they never materialized really. They were promised very early on. And then the persecution of the free press. That happened very, very quickly. There was a satirical magazine in Cuba called Zigzag, very, very funny. And he was not a fan of him being the object of satirical cartoons and articles. So very early, he closed it down. Now they reopened in Miami, and it was even funnier. But very early on, Fidel Castro began to demonstrate who he really was.
Okay. And that prompted you guys to look for greener pastures elsewhere.
Yes, because yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. Now, I've already alluded a little bit to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Can you give us maybe some of the immediate background and also talk about how the whole thing transpired? Like what led the world to the brink of nuclear catastrophe?
Yes. Well, Cuba became one of the epicenters of the Cold War. And by 1962, Cuba was already fully in bed, so to speak, with the Soviets. And they were beginning to provide Cuba with trade. Remember that there's an embargo, so the trade between Cuba and the United States gets cut off. The Soviets step in and begin to purchase Cuba's largest product, which was sugar, at subsidized prices. Actually, they were paying more for it. They were also selling Cuba oil. Interestingly, it was a deal that was very favorable to Cuba. because again, it was under the world market prices. So they're fully in bed economically, and also they begin to uh, align themselves militarily. So there's a transfer of missiles, Soviet missiles, to Cuba. The CIA finds them, takes pictures of them, and that is the immediate cause of the missile crisis. Uh, Kennedy declares an embargo. The Soviets begin to move forward with new rockets. It's a standstill. Uh, I was just too little to know about this, but people who are 10 or more years older than I am remember in school in the United States, they had these uh, ducking exercises. You go underneath your desk because, the world thought that this might be it. Thankfully, that was averted, and there was a negotiation, and the Soviets promised, and they did, to remove those rockets. Fidel Castro was actually furious. How dare they remove those rockets without my permission? I mean, I, he was willing to see the world go up in flames um, if that meant just continuing that antagonism with the United States. Now there were concessions also on the other parts, the removal of armament from Turkey, which was a border state of the Soviet Union. But thankfully, I mean, and we contrast these two, the fiasco that the Bay of Pigs was with the very positively resolved missile crisis. So Kennedy saw the worst day and then some of his best days as a result of averting a global thermonuclear war.
We should all be thankful that he had his good days when he had them. Now, moving ahead a little bit, you mentioned a few times now the trade embargo between the United States and Cuba. That's been a consistent theme, not all the way through, but a pretty consistent theme through U.S. Cuban relations. Can you tell us what has been the goal behind that? Why has it been such a constant theme of American foreign policy towards Cuba? And what has been the effect of that on the regime?
Sure. Um, the objective was to punish Cuba. And Cuba was so dependent on U.S. imports, including food, including things, products just like rice, tools, machinery. And Cuba was also dependent on the U.S. market for sugar, cigars, and other products. Well, it backfired because, as I said earlier, the Soviets took over those spaces of trade. It didn't have that much of an effect on Cuba. Tell you why? Because Cubans could still trade with anybody else in the world. Now, what it did do was that it gave Cuba an excuse to say, here are the imperialist United States trying to destroy us. And that's why they have this, what they call blockade. So it became something like that presented Cuba as a victim in the eyes of the world. Now, as I just said, very recently, last week actually, the sanctions against Cuba, including trade sanctions, have increased.
Right. So before we get to that, and I do want to talk about that for sure, but if this has been such an ineffective policy, if it has harmed the Cuban government, but actually strengthened it in a certain way, insofar as it's made the U.S. this bugaboo, this enemy, this external enemy to focus the Cuban people's wrath against and maybe prop up the regime, why has the United States kept it on for so long?
That's a good question. Why keep something working that hasn't really worked? And I left Cuba 64 years ago. The embargo was in place all these years, and it hasn't really worked. Again, now, when Cuba is in its knees, the Trump administration has strengthened its policy of isolation towards Cuba to strangle its economy. And now it is a moment when it's actually working, particularly because of the obstruction of oil imports into Cuba.
So why now? Why? And I know it's a little bit speculative, but why do you think that the Trump administration has taken this moment to really up the ante towards Cuba? Like, what has prompted them to do that?
Well, yes, there are various reasons. I should say, I meant to say before that the Cuban political lobby in Miami and the political power of Cuban voters in South Florida was one of the main reasons why it was kept in place. They just pressured for it, and the Cuban voting bloc, which had been early on mostly Democratic. People forget about that. Then during the Reagan years, it became almost 90% Republican. In the first time when Obama was elected in 2008, it was almost split. But now we see that that Cuban voting bloc is far more Republican than it was 15, 20 years ago. So they had a lot of power. Why
And given
now?
well, I was just going to say, given that Florida is an important state in presidential elections, that probably takes on an outsized influence too.
That's true, and it's no longer a swing state. I mean, it's gone pretty red. But who knows? The next couple of elections, it might make a difference again. Now, when Cuba hit its deepest crisis after the revolution, and this began 1989, 90, 92, it peaked in 1993. It had to do with the fact that the Soviet Union imploded, and then we had Russia, and Russia began to separate itself from its support of Cuba. That was a time when the Helms-Burton bills and laws, took advantage of that moment of vulnerability to strike hard on Cuba. We are seeing now, the last couple of years, that Cuba is in an even deeper hole. There's a crisis of legitimacy. Uh, Diaz-Canel, the current president, does not have the revolutionary or military credentials that the Castros did. He's actually the butt of jokes among many Cubans. He is not a legitimate leader in the eyes of the population. That's one thing. On the other hand, the COVID pandemic hit Cuba very hard. It paralyzed tourism, which had become the leading source of trade, of income, I should say, for the island. And now what we're seeing with the oil crisis is that, believe it or not, airplanes are not being able to land in Cuba or depart from Cuba because there's no fuel. First of all, the ability to import oil, not just because of the U.S. quasi blockade, but also because Cuba doesn't have the money to purchase oil. And then the infrastructure for refining oil into gas, that's also in shambles. So none of that is working. What that does, it has a multiplying effect, right? Um, you don't have water pumps. That brings problems with the consumption, the distribution and consumption of water. So Cubans are going thirsty, which is hard to imagine. So this is the worst moment, and the Trump administration, in some measure, because Secretary of State Marco Rubio has personal connections and ideological desires, he has played um, some influence on on Donald Trump. Donald Trump, however, doesn't have a Cuba policy. The policy is, well, this is what I'm hearing this week. I'm going to do this. We're going to attack. We're going to take over. But then the crisis in Venezuela and the extraction of Maduro, then the war with Iran, that sort of postpones the intervention that may have already happened had that not been the case. So it is a moment of deep crisis, and Cuba, the regime, has never been closer to ending its rule. Um, it's very serious.
I think in one of your articles I read, you mentioned that there was a lot of brain drain during the Biden administration years because a lot of Cubans, given that he was more liberal in his immigration policy, a lot of Cubans decided to move to America, or I think also move to Nicaragua was a serious thing as well, as I
Yes.
recall. Given that this is all happening, and I know that prognostication is always a sucker's game with things like this, but what do you see as possibly happening? Do you think that it could be the end of the regime, or do you think that it will pull through like it's pulled through so many times in the past?
I think things are now different for all these factors that I mentioned, the lack of legitimacy of the rulers in Cuba, the fact that there's no more Venezuela. Cuba was able to survive after the collapse of the Soviet Union because Venezuela stepped in. Well, guess what? That's not happening anymore. Who's up to the task of doing that now? Iran? Of course not. So I don't want to prognosticate, but this is a scenario that I have in front of me. The war with Iran will not last too long, whether for military or for political reasons. It will come to an end. That will allow the road open to a possible intervention in Cuba. You know, Donald Trump thinks a lot about legacy and what his legacy might be, not just in the United States, but worldwide. And I think seeing and accelerating the end of the Cuban regime is one of them. That may be something that happens after the midterms. So it's very, very possible. And there might be a negotiated solution that would be in the interest of all parties. Last thing we want to see is a bloodbath in Cuba, hundreds of thousands of Cubans leaving in desperation. So the best scenario is a negotiated end to the regime of, I was going to say the Castros. Well, the Castros, because although Fidel is dead, Raul is still alive. He's pretty old, but there are a number of children and grandchildren of the Castros who are growing in power. They're very unpopular, I should say. One of them is an influencer who's exhibiting himself with wealth and driving the fanciest cars, and they have fancy restaurants that they own. So that second and third generation will not be admissible uh, for the Cuban people.
Yeah, when the people are starving and thirsty, it's not a good look to be going to fancy restaurants and driving in luxury cars for sure.
Yes.
All right. Well, Professor, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. I hope everyone out there is praying and hoping that the Cuban people come through this safely. All my listeners, make sure you hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.